Hello everyone, I'm Ant. Today I'm going to walk through my history as a photographer and videographer to give you an insight into the choices that led me to Micro Four Thirds as my current system. Like almost everyone I know, I started my journey on Canon DSLRs. For most, they're the default choice when people start out. And the triple-digit model numbers here in the UK, like the 200D or 800D, known as the Rebel line in the USA, relatively cheap, capable, great ergonomics, and of course, being a DSLR, you get great battery life. Now, I actually studied screenwriting at university back in the late 2000s. At the time, everyone I knew studying on the film course was shooting on the 5D Mark II. It was a breakthrough moment in hybrid cameras, essentially inventing the category, making it more affordable with the 7D line later on using a 1.6x Aps-c crop that was just a little tighter than the Super 35 sensors most cinema cameras use to this day. So when the time came for me to get into photography and filmmaking around 2016, I chose the Canon 100D or SL1. Mirrorless cameras were on the rise, but they had their drawbacks. No one had married a small form factor, great video autofocus and good ergonomics in one body, which was the selling point of the Canon line. I upgraded very quickly to the 200D or the SL2 as soon as it was announced, as it had the flip out screen, the upgrade to the same 24 megapixel sensor as the mid-range 80D, and the revolutionary dual pixel autofocus. I truly loved that little camera, as aside from the flange distance to cover the mirror making it a little deeper, it was as small and light as almost any SLR style mirrorless. Now I wanted to try a mirrorless body as well to compare the viewfinder experience and see what it had to offer. But I also didn't want to go full frame unless I had to for my needs. I already had the razor sharp Sigma f1.8 zooms, wanted to keep using them if I could, and didn't want a hassle of larger lenses if I could help it. So in 2018 my options were either Micro Four Thirds, EOS M, Sony E or Fuji X mounts. The EOS M cameras are lovely little machines, but they were functionally the same as my DSLR in terms of sensor tech, and I was eager to try higher quality 4K video that didn't need an extra crop, like the M50 did. They'd resolved that issue sometime later with the M6 Mark II, but the real nail in the coffin was the lens library. So few good quality native primes, though that's a little better with the Sigma 1.4 DN trio on there, but those lenses are available for most other mounts too. So the E mount held more promise. While it didn't have great first party dedicated crop sensor lens selection, it did have an open mount, so Sigma was already there, and it had a few full frame primes that weren't too much of a compromise in terms of size. But back in 2018 the bodies for crop sensor weren't there. The A6300 and 6500 remain very popular, but I hated the ergonomics and the numerous heating issues they had. They'd go on to improve with the 6400 and A6600, but not enough to tempt me even to this day. Their full frame bodies were not an option, as the cost was prohibitive for even used bodies back then. Now X mount had its appeal. The styling of most of their camera bodies is stunning, and I love the retro controls giving you direct feedback on the exposure triangle. It was the grip that held me back. The only camera they had that felt solid in the hand in 2018 was the XH1, but that was also an expensive body, and I didn't see much of an upgrade path to better features like 10 or 12-bit video, or fast burst speeds. That would change with the XT3 and XT30 released shortly after. A lot of this has been improved with the XT4 and the XS10, and if I'd known what was to come, it might be the system I'd pick now, but hindsight is 2020. So that left me with Micro Four Thirds. I was in a quandary, as a lot of the chatter online points to the slightly smaller sensor being a real issue. However, in practice, it's normally less than a stop of difference in real-world use compared to the best of Aps-c. Since I didn't really go above 1600 or 3200 ISO, I felt that was an adequate trade-off. Plus, with a full lineup of dedicated fast lenses, it outperforms a lot of equivalent systems. Let's take a classic 40mm walk-around pancake lens as an example. 40mm is my favourite focal length for general-purpose street and travel photography. It roughly mirrors the field of view of the human eye, so composition is effortless. Sits between the classics of 35 and 50mm, and I think gives a bit of the best of both. I find 50 quite restrictive for casual photography, but I like the separation over 35mm. 40mm gives me that slightly wider field of view while still giving me that little bit of pop. Now your mileage may vary, of course, but to those who haven't tried it, I'd say give it a go. You might find you like it more than you thought you would. So on to comparing mirrorless options. In the Canon side, you have either the adapted 24mm 2.8 from the DSLRs, or the native 28mm f2 for mirrorless. Fuji has a lovely 27mm 2.8 pancake, and Sony has the 28mm f2 that's the largest crop sensor lens on this list. If you were to go full frame, Canon have a great 40mm 2.8 pancake for DSLRs, as do Nikon with their 40mm 2.8 macro. Representing Micro Four Thirds is the 20mm 1.7 from Panasonic. In terms of light gathering ability and shallow depth of field when doing the equivalence calculations, Panasonic with a quarter of the sensor size of full frame only gives up about half a stop, an f3.4 equivalent against 2.8 to the full frame Canon or Nikon lenses, while it beats the Fuji as well as one of the Canon crops, those being an f4.2 and 4.5 in full frame terms. The 28-2 and 22-2 marginally edge out an equivalent aperture, f3 and 3.2 compared to 3.4, about a third of a stop difference across the range. But the tighter view of the Sony and the Panasonic mean the Canon has the least shallow depth of field of all three. And f3, 3.2 and 3.4 equivalents are so similar it's almost impossible to declare an out-and-out winner there, especially considering price. Sony's about £100 or $150 pricier and 100 grams heavier than the other two lenses. Likewise, if you go wider, comparing the Olympus 12mm f2 against the crop sensor 16mm 2.8 gives almost the exact same results in terms of field of view and depth of field at maximum apertures, though this time the 2.8s are significantly cheaper than the Olympus lens. So I was waiting for the right kind of deal at the right time, and the one that presented itself to me was the Panasonic G7 on a Black Friday sale. A slight drop in resolution for stills compared to what I was used to, 16 to 24 megapixels, but a bump in video specs up to 4K. The autofocus was great for single point AF, but there was no way it could match dual pixel for video. I'll be doing a deeper comparison of these two down the line, as they're both highly capable, compact and affordable camera bodies, as are their successors, the 250D and the G85. So for a while I ran both, the 200D for anything I presented to camera, and whichever I had with me for stills, usually the Canon for events and portraits, and the Panasonic for travel and street photography. About the same time I directed my first short film, having only written previously. I'd originally planned to use the 200D and the Technicolor flat profile, but my cinematographer convinced me to use the original Blackmagic cinema camera instead, with the promise of 10-bit ProRes video. I fell in love with the image quality. It's actually jaw-dropping how good a proper 10-bit log format can look. So when the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 4K was announced with a larger sensor than the original Super 16 and with a Micro Four Thirds mount instead of the EF that the original box camera came with, it cemented my choice of Micro Four Thirds. But I felt I still needed to keep the 200D for this kind of talking head setup with autofocus. Then about a year later, the Olympus E-M1ii had an insane price drop. It went down to just under £1,000 with a free 30mm 3.5 macro and a half price code for Capture One so I could leave Adobe behind. It had the firmware update that gave it phase detect autofocus in video instead of just stills, had a flat OM log profile, and it had the great high res mode, the keystone correction, high speed shooting, great JPEG processing, and the best IBIS in the business. To get a similar spec in full frame would cost almost double on the A7 III, the EOS R, or the Nikon Z6, and they all lost out on features compared to the Olympus. I knew the image quality was good enough for my needs and I pounced. It's been my main shooter ever since. I've since supplemented it with my favourite travel camera, the gorgeous diminutive Panasonic GX80, aka the GX85. You've got rangefinder styling, you've got good controls, it's slim, it's light, and it's with good enough IBIS for breaking the reciprocal rule when needed in low light or stylistic effects, slow shutter speeds, without needing a tripod. Feels great with the smaller Micro Four Thirds primes, and I bring the Olympus if it's anything more demanding, taking my 12 to 40 zoom. So I'm hoping that once the opportunity arises to shoot more short films, I'll finally take the plunge on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, and I'll have the full set for all facets of my image making hobby and budding career. So there you have it, my journey through the bodies and lenses that are now part of my gear haul. Both the cameras that led me to Micro Four Thirds are no longer part of my arsenal. The Blackmagic Cinema camera belonging to my friend Matt, and the G7 now in the ownership of my girlfriend, as she got the photography bug from me. Even today, it remains the best system for my variety of use cases, especially in terms of price to performance. So to have all of my needs met, I weighed up all uses with various systems to give you a rough idea of budgets. So I needed something that had good video quality and autofocus for these talking head videos, something with high quality 10 or 12-bit capture for filmmaking, a stills body for event photography, and a compact stills travel body, ideally rangefinder styling. In terms of Canon, it would be something like the R6 that would meet most of those needs, being capable of 10-bit video, high quality still, and fantastic autofocus. But it's hardly a small body and it costs £2,500 on its own. That would mean something like an M6 with the optional EVF for travel, with a handful of EF lenses I could swap between the two, but that's another £1,000. Sony has the excellently compact A7C or A6600 to meet all the video and photo needs, but I'd have to supplement it with something like the A7S III or FX3 if I wanted 10-bit video, meaning around a £5,000 investment altogether. Now Nikon has a chance for streamlining it all with a Z6 II and an Atomos to get the 10 or 12-bit video over HDMI, but that's still a big full-frame setup with another £2,600 price tag, plus losing out on a more compact travel option. Fuji, once again, is the only other fully featured crop sensor option, with some combination of the XT3, XT30, XT4, XS10 or XE4 offering the right mix of needs in various configurations. I'd probably go with the XE4 for travel and the XS10 for event work and headshots with its better grip, and an Atmos thrown in for the 10-bit output for flexibility and filmmaking. That particular setup comes to a similarly affordable £2,400, comparing favourably to the £2,500 my current body setup will run me once I pick up the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. Either option suits my needs, and if Micro Four Thirds does die out and I can no longer repair or upgrade my gear as needed, Fuji would be my next choice. Now don't forget to leave a like and a comment below on what your journey has been. Were you a DSLR shooter and made the transition to mirrorless like me? Were you a pro using a workhorse like a 5D or a D850 or an old school film buff even? Let me know. I'm fascinated about the choices people make. And take care, everyone.